Hey folks, it is January the 20th, and today for our dual credit course, we are going to go over more characteristics that had to do with the 13 colonies. And I believe we're going to start off with the discussion of the southern colonies. And so, if you remember, we talked about the different colonies we had. It was New England, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. And they were separated by their geography, and the geography helped shape somewhat the culture and economics of the people who live within these areas. And the last we discussed was Delaware.
What was before the middle colonies?
New England.
New England?
So, I see your go back up. Go back to the map. Where are you, Matt? What a mess. Okay, there you go. See, New England, middle colonies, southern colonies, all there on a pretty map. Now, this is an important thing to know just generally. I'm not asking you to memorize these, okay? But it's a good thing to keep in mind because geography really does do a lot to help explain some of the differences between these different folks. But this helps you understand what's the importance of federalism. Remember, federalism is the idea that each individual area takes care of its own interest, but you have a national government there for when you need it. Well, the people of Georgia have very different needs and economic interest and legal interest than the people of Massachusetts. It's just the way it is. They're culturally different too. Most people go to different denominations. They have different relations with Indians, that's for sure. They also are more worried about foreign policy, like Georgia, very close to Spanish soldiers, whereas Massachusetts is closer to, say, the French. So they got different vying interest on who they're worried about. Georgians were closer to Native American tribes that may have been a bit more hostile to colonization. Whereas in Massachusetts, it wasn't quite like that, unless it was during the war. So,
Did we go over Massachusetts?
huh? Did we what?
Did we go over Massachusetts?
I believe we did, but no, not to the same detail, because we just talked with Massachusetts. We just talked about the Pilgrims coming to Plymouth.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I kind of considered that to be that, and later on it'll split off and we'll make Maine.
Yeah, we
All right, so southern, the last of the three physical characteristics, we have the Appalachian Mountains to the west. This is going to be a natural barrier that's going to slow down people going further west into North America from the 13 colonies. But eventually, the King of England is going to make that a distinction as well. And that's going to really get under the colonial people's skin and make them resent the king. Navigable rivers. So once again, shipping your goods is tough on land, but it's inland where you find a lot of the good farmland. Remember, these people are folks who are plantation owners. That's what a lot of the economy is based around. We're going to find before the Civil War in the South, something like 90% of the economy is somehow tied to plantations and slavery. And so because of that, you really have to have navigable rivers because people are going to fill these big barge ships with the produce they're making, especially tobacco right now. Sail them down the river to the harbors where they can go overseas and make lots of money. Richer soil, so that a longer growing season, the warm climate, plenty of raw materials, and natural harbors. So these are safe places for the boats to come. Economic factors, plantations. And of course, plantations also could be like local farms and stuff like that, like growing fruit trees and such. More enslaved people. We're going to see the growth of slavery. It's going to start out as an economic system that's going to have very weird, fuzzy legal boundaries. But over time, it's actually going to become more and more race-based. And It's going to be something that you can inherit. You inherit the status of slavery, where the first generation or two of slaves, they actually came over, and though their parents might have been a slave, their kids would be born free. And they would live in this weird gray area where they didn't have rights, but they weren't slaves or owned by somebody. Class-based society. So down here you have more like the English gentry style people. So a lot of the founders are going to come from here. A lot of the big names are going to come from this area because they come from this well-to-do, well-educated, rich gentleman class based largely around trying to copy themselves after English nobility. And that's why a lot of people came to America. They didn't come to America to come be Americans. They came to America to be just like the well-to-do in England. They wanted to have some of that nobility. Social factors, small coastal towns, Savannah, Baltimore, and Charleston were their large cities. Religious factors, the Church of England. So a good many of them were Anglicans. At first, Maryland is going to have a high Catholic concentration, but that's eventually going to start getting watered down by other denominations, kind of like how Pennsylvania does as well. When it's high Quakers, and then it's going to get watered down with other denominations. Lots of diversity. You're going to have people coming in to the southern colonies from Ireland, Scotland, places like that. But of course, most of the landowners, like I said, are these people who are from England, who are going to have, or their parents or their grandparents are from England. So, just think about it. Of course, the plantation system, I may have told you, actually came from England as well. It was something that was at first imposed upon Ireland. And of course, this happened during a period when you had a very violent invasion of Ireland. Though Ireland had always been at odds with England, and you had a region going up to Dublin that was called the Pale. And beyond the Pale was seen as a barbarous place to the English people. And kings in the past had tried to invade and take over with little success. However, you are going to have, essentially, when there's a theocracy, a Puritan theocracy in charge of England, they will invade and rather brutally just slay whole towns of people to take over the place, and then enslave many people into what we would call plantations here in Ireland. So, John Smith, win or lose, you will never regret working hard, making sacrifices, being disciplined, or focusing too much. Success is measured by what we have done to prepare for competition. So, very fitting for John Smith, an old pirate fighter himself. But it goes to show this is one of the things that sets English colonies apart from, say, French colonies, is that work ethic. A lot of people who came from France were more interested in integrating in and living with the local Native Americans, hunting, fur trapping, and making, just trying to get rich they could by selling furs, but not necessarily like staying there and transplanting France into the new world. Whereas English people were interested in that. All right, our first colony in the southern colonies is Maryland. The English first settled the colony of Maryland in 1634. King Charles I granted the land to Lord Baltimore. Of course, King Charles I is after King James, as we heard earlier. Even though Lord Baltimore established Maryland in order to make a profit, they also established the colony so they can make a living without discrimination because of their Catholic faith. So we have a place much like Pennsylvania and much like Plymouth, where you have people who are religious refugees coming to America to avoid persecution. Charles I was not hostile towards Catholics, but like I told you before, there had been a lot of cross-denominational hostility depending on who's in charge of the English government. And so when you're living within that kind of, within recent memory persecution, you kind of want to get away from it. There's countries today where you can have different forms of persecution and people are just trying to get out of those areas. like to a more modern example, like ISIS. ISIS went around and did a lot of devastating things to people of different religions throughout the Middle East. Not just Christians, but also Kurdish people, and also people who are kind of like more rare Muslim minority groups, right? And there's whole Christian churches that have been around for 2,000 years that have been rendered extinct because many of the people were slain, but many more fled to other countries, essentially dissolving those original churches. Like the Assyrian Church. The Assyrian Church is a Christian faith that had been around for 2,000 years. They had survived multiple empires.
Wow.
Hey, welcome. We're talking about the southern colonies.
Welcome.
Okay. And thank you for not going to the restroom in here.
For sure. Anytime.
But I mean, it's one of those things we see. You could also see economic persecution. Look at places like Venezuela. In Venezuela, they didn't have religious persecutions, but they did have what you call economic persecutions. And because of that, you just had like tens of thousands of those poor people flee throughout the rest of South America. So it's a lot of people do. Things that happen within recent memory can make you want to get out there. We'll wait on for a second. Did anybody finish their book report?
I totally forgot to write the book report.
Just give it to me this week. Give it to me this week.
I was gonna write it instead of I forgot to do that.
Okay, I want y'all to turn it in before we talk about it. Did you finish your book report?
No.
All right, I want y'all to turn it in. Turn it in. Finish this week.
Okay.
All right. So instead of like maybe Friday when you got study hall time or something.
I will finish it then.
That sounds great.
I finished the book. I just didn't finish the book report.
Okay. All right. We're gonna go to the next one. Remember, all of this is online on our Google Classroom for your viewing pleasure. All right, so the Carolinas. So North and South Carolina were one at first. The North Carolina colony was founded in 1653 by the Virginia colonists. And of course, Carolina is Latin for Charles. Like Carolus Magnus, Charlemagne. Carolina is derived from the Latin name Carolus. Oh, hey, I put it down there. Translated as Charles. The state was named in honor of Charles IX of France, and then King Charles I and Charles II of England. So we have multiple Charles. And of course, Charles I was pretty friendly towards France. During the 1660s, the proprietors of this vast colony and land named Carolina was realized that it was not possible for one governor and one assembly to manage a colony as big as Carolina. In 1712, North and South Carolina were officially divided. So it's pretty big. I mean, you see, this is something that it just takes time. A lot of these areas, when people go out, especially in the southern colonies often are pretty void of government. People spread out into large, sprawling plots of land. And unlike like in New England colonies, they did like they did in England. In England, what do? Everybody lives in the village, and then they have to walk to their fields. And so their fields might be big strips, kind of like going out in an angle away from the city or the town, because everyone wants to live within walking distance of the church. In the southern colonies, it's a more like what we'll see out in the West later on. People want a big plot of land, so they just kind of go out there and they move away from everybody to get a plot. It's more dangerous, but it's more independent. It's harder to do certain legal things like file for a marriage to make sure that it's on the books. To, of course, go to church, to do business deals or buy and sell land to make sure it's official. Oh yeah, a lot different. I mean, of course, the thing is it's, and we're going to see this independence. So in many ways, it's going to leave the southern colonies kind of more like the people are more isolated. So when we talk about the American Revolution, I think that isolation is going to have something to do with one of the reasons why it's going to get so brutal in the southern part of the war. Whereas up north, there were such tighter knit communities. I think it kept them together a little better. I don't know. Let's just make the running theory.
No, but, how long is it?
Probably.
You have to. Okay. I'm gonna be able to go.
Huh?
We're
What
talking
tips?
about NHS. I
Ah,
have other things that I have to do after school too.
my goodness, I'm not jealous.
With my youth brand, or my youth brand, with my youth brand. Yeah, listen, my brain is not working at top capacity right
How
now.
was it?
It was good. We won one, we lost one.
Hey, what y'all at?
ACQ.
Yeah.
Which one did you write? Which one did you use?
The
No,
first one we lost.
I know Academic Radio withdrew a lot of their good prizes. They even withdrew their scholarships.
Yeah,
Yeah, are they still doing the writing portions?
no, it's,
2000. Right? Did that sound like what you used?
Let's go ahead and move on to the next one. Our last colony and last southern colony, Georgia. So, while Spanish conquistadors were the first Europeans to explore Georgia, they never set up a permanent colony within its boundaries. And as I mentioned before, there is going to be Spanish troops stationed in Florida. And of course, there will be Spanish explorers much earlier than this time. We're going to make it to Florida, such as like the famous story of Cabeza de Vaca, who him and some other shipwrecked Spaniards are going to like make boats and get shipwrecked into like southeast Texas and have to survive slavery with who was it, the Karankawa Indian, until he finally walks all the way back to Mexico.
Well,
Oh yeah.
we've lost all of them.
Oh yeah, it's a good story. I got a book around here somewhere. It's a really good story about him. Yeah, he survived years as an Indian slave, but he was trained as a doctor in Spain, and so he started practicing some basic medicine with them, like not surgery or anything like that, but like resetting bones and stuff. So he thought he was a medicine man. And since he learned their language, a lot of their languages, he started preaching to them, and so he got a huge following of all these tribes that were walking with him all the way back to Mexico while I was talking about Jesus. But then when he got to Mexico, a group of conquistadors saw all these Indians walking with him, and they actually rounded them up and enslaved them. So he wound up got sailing back to Spain, and he fought for Native American rights before he came back to America and wound up dying somewhere in South America, I think. Oh yeah. Okay, yeah. So later English settlers from South Carolina would travel into Georgia territory to trade with Native Americans they found there. It was not until 1732 the colony of Georgia was actually created. This made it the last of the 13 British colonies to be created. All right. King George II granted the governor of the area, Oglethorpe, the right to create this colony named after him, the King George. Georgia began with the intention to have little land holding and no slavery. It didn't work out. However, when it became a royal colony in 1752, the ban on slavery was lifted. Plantations and slavery became a major part of Georgian economy. Its original intent was to keep Spaniards out. So this meant it was like a buffer state. It's like, hey, there's some Spanish soldiers over there. They were never quite sure how many. It was actually just like a small fort, if memory serves. But that was always enough to give a lot of contention and anxiety to the English settlers and, of course, to the crown. And so by allowing people to populate this no man's land in Georgia, you would at least have some people there who would hopefully scare off any Spanish intrusion. But yeah, we're going to talk about slavery in a minute. So we'll hold off on that one. It's raining so little today. I thought it was supposed to rain. Now it's all right. Let's see. What's next? Okay. So what main things did all of the colonies have in common? Religious freedom and self-government. And that's generally true. Okay. So, but don't get too hung up on like religious freedom here, because you had religious freedom, but you always had consequences. The same can be true today, right? Okay, so what I mean by that is that you had religious freedom away from the crown. If the king said they wanted everyone to be part of the Church of England, you could happily be a Puritan living in America. However, let's say you were a Jewish person living in New York. Well, you still might face some forms of personal persecution, right? It's not modern America. It's not a modern world. Those kind of things, and even today, there's still you still might get discriminated based upon your belief systems within certain circles. Self-government, religious groups, Pilgrims, Puritans, Quakers created communities that were self-governed. So, I mean, there was forms of self-governance in England, like you had your local sheriffs that you could appeal to for protection and stuff like that. And you would have circuit courts that would come and administer justice. But a lot of times they were so tied to the crown that a lot of times people didn't feel like they had a lot of say-so in how things operated. However, within some of the American colonies, we see that it's the locals who are chosen for these positions, the locals who are elected to these positions, and landowners, landowning male citizens were allowed to vote on these things. And so they had more say-so in local governance than like in England, right? So rights did not mean equality. So disagreements between colonial religious leaders led to the formation of various colonies, as we saw with Thomas Hooker. Some colonial legal leaders argued for the extension of voting rights beyond church members, while others wanted to strict standards and laws based on the Old Testament. So that was a big thing, and nobody really honestly objected to the idea of using the Bible as a litmus test for law, because one of the basic principles of American law early on was not just bringing English law. Not all these people were escaping England because they wanted to make an exact replica of England. They wanted a better, more Christian England. And so they would look to like laws made by like Moses, for example. It's found in like Deuteronomy to be kind of like a guide. And so it's one of the reasons why you had so many blue laws in these places, like no traveling on Sunday unless you're going to or from church, for example. No work. Not even cooking in a lot of cases. You cooked your food the day before, so you didn't have to work on the Sabbath, for example. And so, of course, these are local laws. They're not like going across the whole colony. It's something your town might have. In one town, they might have the taverns open on Sunday where people would get drinks, and the other town, they wouldn't even allow alcohol. So, it was varied, it was diverse. Wherever you could live, wherever had your ideas and your values. All right, so slavery, pretty self-explanatory. Slavery is one definition of it I've always heard is it's when you don't have the right to your own labor. But it's also you don't have the right to many other basic rights as well, of course. Political, no political voice, no rights if you're a slave. Economic, labor of the plantation system. Considered property, children considered property and sold with no regard to parents. Human beings were even bred based upon their features. So sounds like something from the Third Reich there. So viewed as outside the American identity as well. So even if you were one of those people who were born black but a freedman, not owned by somebody, you still might not have the same rights as others. Such rights had to do with exclusion from what you might call the old guild system. So, for example, in towns, people who enjoyed certain crafts had to move up from like apprenticeship into journeyman, into masters and all that stuff in order to be a hat maker, a printer, a barrel maker, a shoemaker, and all that. Well, African Americans weren't allowed to do those things. You weren't allowed to be a princess. I'm teaching like them and streaming. Yeah. Do you need something? A cup? No, sorry. Just go drink out of the water fountain. Go sip it up.
What's that?
It's, yeah, it's Mason. I gave him a cup one time. It's like feeding a stray dog. All right. I should have given him a dirty cup. All right. So slavery initially was actually just a quick replacement for what we saw as the indentured servant system. And if you remember, indentured servants were poor young men who came to America to work for a certain period of time for somebody who either had a business or a plantation. However, their life expectancy was low. And they were actually, many of them were treated just as bad as slaves. They could be whipped. In some cases, they were killed by their masters. If they were women, they were also abused in other ways, as I'm sure you can imagine. And so a lot of people in England, especially when work started becoming more available in England, definitely did not want to make the trip. And so to fill that void in labor, you start having slaves being purchased. Most of the slaves were bought from the Caribbean, as many slave owners saw buying people directly from Africa as too dangerous, because a lot of African slaves were actually war prisoners. And the last thing a lot of plantation owners wanted to do was bring trained warriors into their home. Another thing too is you weren't always sure if they would survive the climate or the local diseases. And so the Caribbean kind of acted as a halfway point. Spanish, Portuguese, and English-owned colonies along the African border would purchase slaves from African tribes who brought in people from deeper in the country. They would load them up on boats and bring them to the Caribbean. There in the Caribbean, they would go through what was known as a seasoning period, where they would have to survive some odd amount of months. And the ones who survived would then get shipped to different parts of the world, where there's Spanish colonies for a while, but Spaniards would illegalize it sooner than most people. And then American colonies, where they were brought to ports and purchased, and all that. So, sorry, the picture's not showing up. But what was known as the Middle Passage, when these enslaved people were brought over, was also extremely brutal. People were almost quite literally stacked upon one another for a months-long voyage, filled with human filth, barely fed, abused, away from sunlight, surrounded by strangers, not being told what's happened. It was a terrible, terrible ordeal. All right, so slavery continued. Impact of slavery in the South. Enslaved people viewed as property and a labor supply. We already said that. aided in the development of plantation system and agrarian southern economy. It's going to be very little at first compared to what it will be before the Civil War. Slavery was constantly growing, but it's not going to grow all of that fast as it will once we have the invention of the cotton gin later on. So remember, this is a reality. It is there, but it's not like just teeming throngs of enslaved people like we're going to find 100 years from this period. Okay, so it was something that was coming, but and it was common enough, but it wasn't just like half the population.
They were paid.
Well, I mean, like sometimes you could be paid, right? So like, but a lot of places are actually going to make it illegal for them to get paid later, illegal for them to learn how to read, illegal for them to be alone without an escort. But yeah, at first, if one so chose to do so, a master could pay their slave. No political voice, limited restricted rights. That includes not even having the right to go to court. Very early on in colonial days, an enslaved person could, in some cases, go to court, but that's going to, and that's one thing about the legal theories about what happens to slavery, like what created our idea of racism in North America. They're not really sure, but some historians can look at legal precedents. Whereas, like the first slaves that came over, there was no distinction. They could go to court, they could marry, they could have children that were born free, and they could even have property rights. But over time, it becomes more and more restricted. And over time, you're going to see more and more racial slander towards these folks. But it's really going to get hot and heavy before the Civil War. And a lot of it might have to do with what I think is like opposition politics, right? It's like those people up north want us to free these people. Well, they're not on our side, so let's show how we think we can demonize these people. As personally, I think we got a bit of that today on other issues. Well, that side's for this, therefore we're going to go the polar opposite of this. I don't know. So, social, lowest social class, that's absolutely true. Limited access to education, if any. You might learn your trade, your minimal part of a trade. Socially isolated. And that's true. People were torn away from their families, their tribes. A slave could come from a completely different part of Africa and be put in with people, and he doesn't speak English, and they don't speak his dialect of whatever he's speaking. Now, Africa is full of a lot of languages, especially back then. So it's just they just don't have any connection. Anyway. Just be alone. So not too cheery. All right, let's go next one. What do I got here? Indentured servitude. So going back in time. All right, so a little bit about indentured servants. So as an indentured servant, you were typically a poor young male who signed a contract and worked for a master at a set period of time, usually 4 to 6 years. It could go beyond that, especially if you owned a significant debt or if you're trying to learn a more rigorous trade. In exchange for transportation to the colony, food, and shelter, they often learned a trade. This is basically mirrored off of the apprentice to master guild systems throughout the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. You're going to find it's a pre-industrial era type of education that carries on into this period. At the end of their period of indenture, they might receive land, money, or tools and supplies to start their own farms. However, being an indentured servant, kind of like the old Roman paterfamilias, you would have these masters had like the right of life and death over their servants. So you weren't just an indentured servant. You had no rights under your master, and they could totally throttle you, starve you, work you half to death. And so, or they could be very nice to you and marry you off to their daughter. So, I don't know. Depends on who you ended up with. By the late 1600s, economic conditions in England improved, and fewer people came as indentured servants, as I mentioned earlier. By the 1690s, planters found that they could earn more money if they did not have to pay laborers. So, I mean, it makes sense, right? Free people are cheaper. I mean, there's the initial costs, and of course, you have to, take care of them at least to a certain sustenance degree. So planters turned to slavery. As tobacco production increased, so did slavery. And tobacco was like catching on fire, no pun intended, in Europe.
I think Tom was very
That
into
was not intended. I hate dad jokes. I really do. Like, my wife was like, I don't know. She was trying to get me in on puns the other day. I'm like, I can't do it. I can't do it. But she likes it. Why do you like it? Okay, so it's because she has a good heart, and my sense of humor is more cruel. All right.
it.
So, and yeah, and this was the place, this was the only place that had tobacco that Europeans wanted. Like I told you, they had tobacco in the Middle East, but they thought that stuff was too strong and stinky. They didn't want it. They wanted American tobacco. And it's one of those products where when people try it long enough, they want more and more of it. It's like, hooray, great business model.
Yeah.
It's like a super addictive game, I guess. So, my phone doesn't. So, where there's profits, you will find people who want their profit, and will do whatever it takes to do. All right, let's see where we're at. Okay, so next one. All right, talked a little bit about this triangular slave trade. So, a lot of this has to do with back when we were talking about the overarching economic theory of the day that had to do with what was that pre-capitalism thing called again? Do y'all remember I told you that it had to do with the idea that there's a finite amount of wealth in the world, and that state power saw colonies as a way to export the raw goods or
Are you trying to think of the name of the guy?
mercantilism is the
Mercantilism,
word. Yeah.
yes.
So this is an extension of mercantilism because the mother country wants to sell to its colonies, but they also want the goods from the colonies, like the raw materials to make things with. And so the triangular slave trade ties directly into this. The colonies provide things like leathers, woods, tobacco, tar, things like that, and they sell them in food and they bring it back to England. England uses those resources to make finished goods. They use finished goods. Yes, they sell it back to the colony. But as part of the triangle, the southern part of the leg, they trade those things to Africans for African people. And then those people are shipped off back to the Americas. So it's a triangular trade. A trade route involving 3 ports in a fixed sequence. The triangular slave trade began in West Africa, where slave ships acquired slaves to transport and sell them to the New World. The second stage, often in the West Indies, Caribbean, where the slaves were sold and either sugar or molasses traded. So, that was a really big deal up there, though there will be some sugar growing up in North America, not nearly as much as to compete here. So places we might think of such as Cuba or the Dominican Republic and Haiti had a lot of this. And it was known as the cruelest, most back-breaking form of slavery. And the slave owners down there, many of them Spanish or Portuguese or French, would essentially work their slaves literally to death. They had the whole idea where they thought of them as machinery that wasn't worth fixing. You give them minimal amounts of food and you work them until they die of malaria or back-breaking work, and then you get another person to replace them. So sad things. Though some of them, like I told you, were seasoned and then sold up to the North Americans. At other times, it was the American South where the product taken aboard was cotton, or tobacco. Of course, cotton will grow, cotton is in demand, but the problem is that cotton takes so much time to get all the little seeds out of the bolls, the flowering part of the plant, the white part, until Eli Whitney invents his cotton gin.
Cotton gin, yeah.
The third step was a manufacturing area where either New England or Britain, where the raw materials were unloaded and sold, and manufactured goods were received. Ships then voyaged to West Africa to exchange the manufactured goods for slaves, and the cycle continued on and on and on until England is going to illegalize the importation of slaves from Africa, and then America is going to do the same. And then you're essentially going to have a whole homegrown industry in America, sorted as it is, of breeding enslaved people to make new enslaved people. So it's definitely bizarre when you think about it from a modern standpoint. I mean, the idea of breeding individuals so that you can take their children from them. I mean, it's extremely foreign. All right, so let's look at the little pictograph. So here we go. So here you go. Europe, Africa, and like they said, the triangle can kind of shift around where the entry and the exit points are. But the Atlantic slave trade, and of course, if you take slavery kind of out of it, you could call it the Columbian Exchange. And the Columbian Exchange is basically how we're talking about things such as plants and animals moving from one half of the world to the other. For example, potatoes and tomatoes came from America. Well, through the Columbian Exchange, they're going to end up in Europe and the rest of the world.
We got guns, iron bars, glass and glass beads, and cotton cloth.
Yeah, so sometimes these things would come back over here. And of course, things like apples and wheat make it to America and grow here, and so on and so forth. So you'd have this exchange for these things, which is from one part of the world go to another, as cultivated invasive species. And of course, here in America, like hogs, for example, we got wild hogs all over the place. I saw a whole bunch of them on the side of the road on the way home yesterday. Well, those are, of course, from Europe. Cows from Europe. In fact, in the Americas, the biggest working animal they had was llamas. So, yeah,
Llamas?
that's the biggest domesticated animal that were in the Americas. And they were used for some work in the Andes by the Inca people. But up here in North America, the biggest domesticated animal they had were like medium-sized dogs. I mean, that was it. Hey, I think we're going to end it there. We'll pick back up next time and talk about the Middle Passage. It's going to be a big part of what's going to shape America. We're going to have a whole huge civil war that is going to have a major part of it due to slavery. So, and it's going to have a lot of repercussions from there. All right. That's going to end our lecture for today. See you Friday.